up, and let's be honest, we're all left with more questions than answers. And the biggest question of them all? What is Ferrari hiding? Because that third day didn't exactly go to plan. McLaren seems to have found something special, looking stronger with each lap, while Red Bull appears to be playing their usual game of keeping their cards close to their chest. But Ferrari, they've been throwing out mixed signals, and we can't tell if they're quietly confident or quietly panicking. There's no doubt that Bahrain could have gone better for some teams, especially Ferrari and Red Bull. These two had a lot more in reserve but have openly admitted they're not getting exactly what they wanted from their cars. And while Red Bull's struggles were somewhat expected after their late-season performance dip in 2024, Ferrari's inconsistencies raised a few more eyebrows. Maranello is entering the season with high hopes of finally bringing home a championship, but based on the first impressions of the SF25, they might need to rethink their expectations. Fred Vasseur was the first to step up and address the situation, trying to keep the fans from hitting the panic button. He insists there's nothing to worry about. Circumstances in Bahrain were unusual, to put it mildly. While the SF25 showed some issues on the cold asphalt, Vasseur believes those problems won't carry over to Australia. Digging into this, he explained that temperatures will go from the 10 to 15 degrees Celsius we saw in Bahrain to 45 degrees Celsius in Melbourne, which means we could be looking at an entirely different story down under. But here's the real question. Is that just wishful thinking, or is Ferrari genuinely confident that the SF25 is a hidden beast waiting to be unleashed in the right conditions? One of the biggest concerns surrounding Ferrari's 2025 Challenger is whether it actually has championship-winning potential. Based on testing, the raw pace wasn't quite where it needed to be compared to McLaren. And while yes, teams sandbagged during testing, McLaren has also been holding back, meaning their real potential might be even higher once they fully unleash the MCL39 in Melbourne. What makes this even more intriguing is Ferrari's radical shift in car design. They've carried over just 1% from last year's SF24 to the SF25, essentially meaning they're starting fresh. And with this being the final year under the current regulations, there's very little room to make major changes if something goes horribly wrong. Ferrari already has updates in the pipeline, but until they arrive, they need to make the most out of what they have. So, what exactly is wrong with the SF25? For starters, Ferrari's 2025 car has a much stronger front end. This isn't just due to their new pull rod suspension setup, but also because the center of aerodynamic load has shifted forward. This benefits front-limited circuits, but in return, it creates instability at rear-limited tracks like Bahrain. This could explain why Ferrari isn't panicking yet. If their weakness in Bahrain was just a track-specific issue, then it might not be as much of a problem elsewhere. But here's the catch. A lot of circuits throughout the season will also test rear stability, meaning Ferrari needs to widen their operating window if they want to be competitive across all types of tracks. Another thing Ferrari experimented with in testing was a lighter medium downforce rear wing. While every car has its own aerodynamic mapping, Ferrari's setup was notably similar to McLaren's, but less stable than Red Bull and Mercedes. That meant some of the SF25's handling issues were amplified more than expected, particularly in braking stability. This is an area that Ferrari engineers need to fix ASAP, because while the car clearly has potential, it still has fundamental issues that need ironing out before the season opener. And what do the drivers think? Both Leclerc and Hamilton have remained mostly positive, though their reactions suggest they might not be 100% convinced yet. Hamilton, for example, has seemed far more comfortable in the car despite the third-day tyre degradation that ruined his planned race simulation. Speaking about the SF25's performance, Hamilton admitted, "Over the past 4 years, I haven't been able to judge cars too much just from first impressions. In the older generation, you could know pretty quickly where you stood. But I'd say this is the most positive feeling I've had in a long time. Personally, I like to just jump in and figure things out, and that's what we've been doing. We've gone through the process, built a solid foundation, and we're seeing tight competition. We might not know exactly where we stand until race week, but we know there's work to do." That's cautious optimism from Hamilton, which makes sense given that this is his first time in a new car since switching to Mercedes in 2013. But here's the real key. Hamilton is nearing 40 years old, yet his motivation and ability to extract the absolute maximum from a car remain just as sharp. If anything, His experience and relentless drive might be what Ferrari needs to unlock the SF25's full potential. Leclerc, on the other hand, was a bit less enthusiastic. While he wasn't outright negative, his words suggested that Ferrari still has a lot of work to do before Melbourne. We're seeing the numbers we expected, but on Thursday afternoon and Friday, we struggled a bit more with the car's balance. There's still a lot of work to be done. No doubt, the weather played a big role, not just in temperature, but also in the wind. I'd wait a bit longer before making any big predictions. Right now, we're working hard to improve the balance. We'll see in Melbourne, but we struggled a bit more in the last 2 days. The takeaway: Ferrari knows what's wrong with their car. The real question is whether they can fix it in time for the first race. Because while the SF25 has potential, it may not be as big a leap forward as we were led to believe. Pre-season hype suggested that Ferrari had made a major step toward Red Bull and McLaren, but based on Bahrain's results, they might still be playing catch-up. Of course, testing times don't tell the full story, and we can't rely solely on these results. But Ferrari can't afford to be too relaxed either. They're entering the season with a completely new car that's giving their drivers mixed feelings about what to expect in race conditions. Leclerc also pointed out that weather conditions played a big role in Bahrain's unpredictable results. It's difficult to confirm exactly how the SF25 feels because I don't think I've ever experienced a storm like this before in testing. It was cold, it rained. It's not what we're used to here. That makes it hard to compare with past years where we had much warmer conditions. Obviously, we focus on ourselves, but we also look at what others are doing, even if we don't know their exact programs. There are still many unknowns, so we have to take lap times with a grain of salt. Ferrari still has high hopes for 2025, and they've poured a ton of resources into this new design. But whether that gamble will pay off remains to be seen. The battle at the front is expected to be Ferrari versus McLaren. The Mercedes comments are setting up an interesting narrative where Russell and Antonelli could shake things up by stealing a few victories and valuable points throughout the season. Ferrari is under massive pressure to prove that their bold redesign of the SF25 was worth the risk. Pre-season testing has given hints about where the pecking order might stand, but let's be real, testing is always a bit of a guessing game. Teams hide performance, sandbag, test different fuel loads, and run experimental setups, all of which make it nearly impossible to get a clear picture of true race pace. But one thing is certain, Ferrari isn't heading into 2025 as the outright favorite, and that's a problem for a team that desperately wants to break their 16-year title drought. Despite all the question marks, Ferrari isn't out of the fight. The SF25 might not have been spectacular in Bahrain, but there are genuine reasons to believe they'll be a threat once the season kicks off. One of the biggest areas of improvement in the SF25 is its front-end responsiveness. The new pull-rod suspension and aerodynamic shifts have given the car much better turn-in stability, which is huge for circuits that rely on precise corner entry. Tracks like Monaco, Suzuka, and Singapore could play right into Ferrari's hands. While Ferrari struggled on single-lap pace, their long-run consistency was actually quite solid. Their biggest enemy last season was tyre degradation, particularly on rear-limited circuits like Bahrain. While testing showed some tyre wear concerns, it wasn't nearly as catastrophic as in 2024. If Ferrari can optimize their race trim, they might not need to rely on pole position to challenge for victories. Hamilton's experience is proving to be a valuable asset to Ferrari. His detailed technical feedback, combined with his aggressive driving style, is helping the engineers make adjustments faster than they did in previous years. He's also pushing the team to adopt a Mercedes-style approach to data analysis and race execution, which could be crucial in fine-tuning the SF25. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Ferrari still has major hurdles to overcome. One of the most concerning trends from testing was Ferrari's rear-end instability under braking and acceleration. This is a huge problem for circuits that require strong traction out of slow corners, like Bahrain, Australia, and Hungary. If Ferrari can't sort this out quickly, they'll be vulnerable to McLaren and Red Bull in race conditions. It's all smiles and handshakes now, but Ferrari isn't known for handling internal rivalries well. History tells us that when two top-tier drivers share the same garage, things can get messy fast. If Hamilton starts outperforming Leclerc early on, will Ferrari naturally shift toward him as their lead driver? And if Leclerc feels undermined, could that fracture the team's unity? This has all the ingredients for a blockbuster power struggle. Red Bull was underwhelming in Bahrain. Verstappen wasn't happy with the RB21, and the team struggled with overheating issues. But this is Red Bull we're talking about. They have a history of holding back performance in testing only to show up on race day and completely obliterate the competition. If they'd been hiding their true pace, Ferrari and McLaren could be in for a rude awakening in Melbourne. While all the talk has been about Ferrari, the real team that could shake things up is McLaren. The MCL39 was arguably the most impressive car in testing, showing strong one-lap and race pace. Norris and Piastri both look comfortable, and if their upgrades work as expected, they could legitimately be in the title fight. McLaren finished 2024 as the second fastest team. If Ferrari thought they were the only ones challenging Red Bull, they might have severely underestimated what's coming. Ferrari needs to prove their pace translates to real race conditions. Testing showed flashes of potential, but will that be enough against a more polished McLaren or a possibly sandbagging Red Bull? Mercedes could be the wild card. Russell looked decent, and Antonelli is a mystery factor that could throw a wrench into the top team's plans. McLaren might be the biggest threat to Red Bull, not Ferrari. If Norris and Piastri start beating Ferrari in the first few races, Maranello might have a bigger problem than just Verstappen. Expect chaos if Ferrari's driver dynamic explodes. Leclerc and Hamilton will remain professional, for now, but if one starts to edge ahead, things could get spicy really fast. At the end of the day, Ferrari isn't out of it, but they also aren't ahead. Their biggest challenge won't just be beating Red Bull. It'll be keeping McLaren behind while making sure their own drivers don't start fighting each other. Hamilton's presence is already forcing Ferrari to evolve, but the SF25 isn't perfect yet. The Australian GP will be the real test. If they can challenge for the win, Ferrari fans should feel optimistic. But if they're still a step behind McLaren and Red Bull, they might be looking at another long season of what could have been. Ferrari heads into the 2025 season with a mixture of hope, expectation, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. Pre-season testing in Bahrain didn't provide the clear dominance that many tifosi were hoping for, but that doesn't mean the Scuderia is out of the fight. Far from it. While the SF25 might not have set the world alight in testing, the car still showed promising signs in both long-run pace and front-end stability. The real question is whether those strengths will be enough to consistently challenge Red Bull and McLaren across an entire season. One of Ferrari's biggest concerns coming out of testing was the car's inconsistency across different track conditions. The SF25 performed well in certain scenarios but struggled in others, particularly with rear-end instability under braking. That's a worrying issue, especially for circuits that require strong traction out of slow corners, something Red Bull has mastered over the past few years. If Ferrari can't get this problem under control quickly, they'll find themselves playing catch-up once again. And then there's the tyre degradation question. Last season, Ferrari's biggest Achilles heel was how hard they chewed through their rear tyres. While the SF25 appears to be an improvement in this area, Bahrain still exposed some weaknesses. During longer runs, the Ferrari drivers experienced noticeable drop-offs in lap times compared to McLaren, which could be a major issue in races where strategy and tyre management play a decisive role. Despite all these question marks, there are plenty of reasons for Ferrari fans to remain optimistic. The raw speed of the SF25 may not have been fully unleashed yet. Teams rarely show their true hand during testing, and Ferrari may be holding back some pace for the opening race in Australia. More importantly, both Leclerc and Hamilton were generally positive about the car, and their driving styles seemed to align well with its characteristics. That's crucial because having two drivers pushing in the same developmental direction will only accelerate Ferrari's progress. However, the elephant in the room remains the internal driver dynamic. On paper, Ferrari has the strongest driver lineup on the grid. A seven-time world champion in Hamilton, who still has the hunger to fight at the front, and a young, aggressive talent in Leclerc, who has been carrying Ferrari's hopes for years. But how long will this harmony last? We've seen time and time again that when two elite drivers are in the same team, tensions inevitably rise. Hamilton versus Rosberg. Alonso versus Hamilton. Vettel versus Leclerc. History tells us that at some point, one driver will start to assert dominance over the other, and how Ferrari handles that situation will be key to their success in 2025. If Hamilton finds his rhythm early and starts outperforming Leclerc, will Ferrari naturally shift towards supporting him as their number one driver? And if Leclerc feels like he's being sidelined, will that disrupt the unity within the team? On the flip side, if Leclerc is the stronger driver in the opening races, how will Hamilton react to playing second fiddle for the first time in over a decade? The balance of power within Ferrari is one of the most fascinating storylines heading into the season. Meanwhile, Red Bull is lurking in the shadows. Their pre-season testing performance wasn't as dominant as we've come to expect, but let's not kid ourselves, this is still the team to beat. Verstappen wasn't fully comfortable with the RB21, but Red Bull has a history of sandbagging in testing and then showing up on race day with a car that's untouchable. If they've been hiding their true performance, Ferrari and McLaren could be in for a rude awakening in Melbourne. Speaking of McLaren, they could be the real dark horse in this championship battle. The MCL39 was arguably the most impressive car in testing, showing strong pace on both single laps and long runs. Norris and Piastri look comfortable, and their development trajectory suggests they might be ready to take the next step and challenge for wins consistently. If McLaren proves to be faster than Ferrari in the opening races, Maranello will have to rethink their approach because Red Bull might not be their only problem. Mercedes is the biggest wild card. Russell looked solid in testing, and Antonelli is the unknown factor that could shake up the grid. The W15 appears to be more competitive than last year's car, but whether it has enough outright pace to fight for wins remains to be seen. If Mercedes is back in the mix, that only makes Ferrari's task more difficult. Ferrari is at a crossroads. They've spent years developing a car that can challenge for titles, and now they finally have two drivers capable of delivering a championship. But the SF25 isn't perfect. The team needs to act fast to iron out its weaknesses before Red Bull or McLaren builds an early points gap that becomes impossible to close. The Australian Grand Prix will be the first true test of Ferrari's potential. If they can fight for victory, then the optimism is justified, and 2025 could finally be the year they reclaim their spot at the top. But if they're still trailing behind Red Bull and McLaren, the questions will only grow louder. Have they really built a championship-worthy car? Or is this just another case of close, but not close enough? What do you think? Is Ferrari genuinely struggling? Or are they holding back their true performance for Melbourne? Will Hamilton and Leclerc be able to work together? Or is a power struggle inevitable? And who will be their biggest rival? McLaren, Red Bull, or even Mercedes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want the latest updates on what Piastri had to say about McLaren's